One finds, in the annals of the Second World War, certain moments where the sheer force of a single man's will appears to bend the very course of history. Such a moment, etched in defiance and cigar smoke, occurred on the evening of the 22nd of March, 1945. Within the makeshift headquarters of the United States Third Army near Oppenheim, Germany, the air was thick with a palpable tension. It was precisely 8:47 p.m. General George S. Patton Jr., at 59 years of age, stood before a vast map of Germany, a monolith of command and simmering fury. His uniform was immaculate, his boots polished to a mirror sheen, yet his eyes held a storm. A thick cigar was clamped between his teeth, its grey ash growing precariously long, a perfect metaphor for the situation at hand. A mere 8 kilometers to his east, the formidable Rhine River, the last great natural barrier protecting the heart of the Rhine, flowed dark and silent under a sliver of moon. It was the Rubicon of this war, and he was forbidden to cross it. His Third Army, a magnificent instrument of war honed to a razor's edge, had become a legend. In 9 months, it had advanced an astonishing 965 kilometers, a blitzkrieg in reverse. It had liberated the majority of France, shattered the formidable German defenses in the Saarland, and now stood poised on the threshold of victory. The scent of Berlin was in the air, a prize he could almost taste. Yet, a dispatch had just arrived from the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, a piece of paper that felt heavier than a block of concrete. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander and a man Patton both respected and privately derided for his caution, had ordered him to halt. Not just to halt, but to wait. To stand down and, in the ultimate professional indignity, to surrender his army's lifeblood, its petrol, its ammunition, its vital bridging equipment, to the British. All of it was to be redirected north to Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group for their meticulously planned, grand-scale crossing of the Rhine at Wesel. Patton plucked the dispatch from the table, his movements dangerously deliberate. He read the operative phrases aloud, his voice a low growl that filled the hushed command tent, each word dripping with contempt for his staff to hear. The Third Army will hold its present defensive positions west of the Rhine until further notice, he snarled, his gaze sweeping over the faces of his officers. All Class 3 petrol supplies, Class V munitions, and bridging equipment will be immediately redirected to the 21st Army Group in support of Operation Plunder. He paused, letting the humiliation of the words hang in the air like cordite. Then, with a sudden, violent motion, he crushed the paper into a tight ball and hurled it to the muddy floorboards. The room was deathly quiet, only the gentle hiss of a paraffin lamp dared to make a sound. "I am going to cross that bloody river," he declared, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial yet resolute tone. He turned from the map, his eyes locking onto each of his senior officers, challenging any one of them to object. "I'm going to cross it before Monty, and if I have to siphon every last liter of petrol from the First Army to do it, then by God, I will." His chief of staff, Brigadier Hobart Hapgay, a man accustomed to his commander's tempestuous nature, stared at him with an expression of profound disbelief. Gay was the anchor to Patton's storm, the calm voice of reason that had so often tempered the general's more outrageous impulses. "George," he began, his tone cautious, "that is a direct order from Ike himself. You cannot simply ignore it." A slow, predatory smile spread across Patton's face. It was a smile that promised trouble, a smile that had unnerved German field marshals and Allied commanders alike. "I'm not going to ignore it, Hobart," he replied smoothly, the cigar wagging for emphasis. "I'm going to reinterpret it." What General Patton was about to set in motion over the next 72 hours would constitute a masterclass in calculated insubordination. It would involve the flagrant violation of a half-dozen direct orders, the brazen theft of resources from an Allied army, and the deliberate, exquisite humiliation of the British commander whom he considered, with every fiber of his being, to be the most overrated officer of the entire war. In doing so, he would succeed in crossing the Rhine a full 24 hours before Montgomery's Grand Armada, accomplishing the feat with a fraction of the resources and, in an almost miraculous turn of events, without the loss of a single American life in the initial assault. The crux of Patton's predicament was a matter of simple, brutal logistics, a subject that bored him in theory but which he understood with an intuitive genius in practice. His Third Army had moved with such astonishing speed that it had, in effect, outrun its own supply chain. The Red Ball Express, the heroic trucking effort that sustained the Allied advance, was stretched to its breaking point. American supply lorries were now forced to travel a punishing 450-kilometer round trip from the vast depots in France to Patton's forward positions in Germany. The arithmetic of this endeavor was unforgiving. For every 5 liters of petrol a lorry delivered to the front, 1 liter was consumed in the journey to get it there. It was a logistical nightmare of diminishing returns. Faced with this scarcity, Eisenhower, ever the coalition commander, had made the pragmatic, if infuriating, decision to concentrate the limited supplies on Montgomery's Operation Plunder. This was to be the main effort, the decisive blow, a massive, set-piece crossing designed to be the primary spearhead for the final invasion of Germany. Montgomery's plan, one must admit, was breathtaking in its scale, a testament to the British doctrine of overwhelming material superiority. It was war conducted as a vast, industrial program. The order of battle called for 25 divisions, numbering over 250,000 men. It involved a staggering 3,500 pieces of artillery, 1,200 armored fighting vehicles, and a preparatory aerial bombardment by the Royal Air Force that would last for 4 continuous days. The plan included the simultaneous construction of 12 heavy-duty pontoon bridges across the river at Wesel and, for good measure, the deployment of 2 entire airborne divisions, 1 British, 1 American, behind the German lines to secure the far bank. The scheduled date for this gargantuan undertaking was the 24th of March, 1945. Field Marshal Montgomery had publicly stated on numerous occasions, with his characteristic air of professorial certainty, that the Rhine could only be crossed with meticulous preparation and absolute superiority in men and material. To Patton, this was not prudence, it was cowardice masquerading as caution. It was the timid, unimaginative approach of a man who waged war by slide rule and logistical chart, rather than by instinct and audacity. Patton was not prepared to wait for Montgomery's meticulously prepared parade. He believed the enemy was broken, reeling, and that a swift, sharp jab could collapse their defenses entirely. He had a problem, however. Without petrol, his beloved tanks were little more than 30-ton steel pillboxes. Without ammunition, his artillery was silent. And without assault boats, his infantry could do little more than stare angrily across the river at the Rhine. Eisenhower's order was unequivocal: all Class 3 supplies, petrol, Class V supplies, munitions, and bridging equipment were to be sent north to support Montgomery. So, Patton did what he always did when the established rules proved inconvenient to his designs for victory: he broke them, shattered them, and remade them in his own image. At 2,300 hours on the 22nd of March, a scant few hours after receiving Eisenhower's directive, he summoned his G4, his chief logistics officer, Colonel Walter Müller, to his tent. Müller was a quiet, efficient officer, a man who dealt in the hard realities of numbers, tonnage, and timetables. Walter, Patton began without preamble, jabbing a finger at the map. I need 400,000 liters of petrol by dawn tomorrow. I don't give a damn where you get it. Müller blinked, his face a mask of professional confusion. He looked at the general as if he had finally taken leave of his senses. Sir, he stammered, we've just received direct orders from SHEF to transfer all of our remaining reserves to the 21st Army Group. We don't have 400,000 liters, General. We barely have 50,000. Patton leaned forward over his campaign desk, his imposing figure casting a long shadow across the tent. His voice dropped to a low, conspiratorial whisper. Walter, do you happen to know where the First Army keeps its main petrol depots? The U.S. First Army, commanded by the steady and reliable General Courtney Hodges, was positioned directly to the north of Patton's Third Army. Crucially, their supply lines ran along many of the same arterial roads. Müller, a man of logistics, immediately grasped the outrageous implication of his commander's question. The color drained from his face. General, he said, his voice barely audible, that would be theft. Grand larceny, sir. From an Allied army. Patton's dangerous smile returned, wider this time. "It's not theft if we intend to pay it back eventually, Walter," he countered, the logic entirely his own. "Besides, who's going to complain? Is Hodges really going to admit in an official report to Ike that he somehow misplaced 400,000 liters of petrol? I think not." Patton, as he so often was in matters of human nature and military bureaucracy, was absolutely correct. In the controlled chaos of a continental war, with thousands of lorries rumbling day and night over shattered roads and through darkened forests, it was remarkably easy for entire supply convoys to be misdirected. By 01:15 hours on the 23rd of March, 3 full platoons of 3rd Army Military Police were dispatched under the cover of darkness. They weren't sent to maintain order, they were sent to create a very specific kind of disorder. They established impromptu checkpoints at key road junctions along the 1st Army's supply routes. Their mission was simple: to halt any and every petrol convoy heading north, and to reroute them south, towards the 3rd Army's thirsty depots. The scenes at those crossroads must have been remarkable. 1st Army lorry drivers, tired and road-weary, protested vehemently. Their logistics officers, brandishing their official manifests, demanded to see written orders sanctioning this diversion. Patton's military policemen offered no paperwork. They simply gestured with their M1 carbines and offered a simple, unassailable explanation: orders from General Patton. "You'll take the South Road." Over the next 18 hours, through a combination of bluff, intimidation, and sheer audacity, Patton's army acquired 412,000 liters of high-octane petrol. Along with the fuel, they managed to liberate 80 tons of artillery ammunition and, most critically, 24 precious assault boats, all of which technically belonged to General Hodges and the 1st Army. Hodges himself would not discover the full extent of the theft for another 3 days. By then, of course, it would be far too late. Yet the purloined petrol was only half of Patton's audacious scheme. The other, more delicate half was to get his men across the Rhine without Eisenhower discovering the operation until it was a fait accompli, an irreversible fact on the ground that would be impossible to undo. Eisenhower's order had been precise: maintain defensive positions west of the Rhine. To any normal commander, this meant to dig in, to hold the line, to wait. But Patton was a connoisseur of language, a master of finding the exploitable loophole in any military directive. He gathered his stunned staff and laid out his reinterpretation. "Defensive does not mean static," he argued, the glint in his eye daring them to disagree. "The Germans are on the east bank of the river. To maintain an effective defense, we must know their strength and disposition. Therefore, we require robust reconnaissance patrols to observe them." He paused, letting the absurd logic build. "And if those patrols should happen to need to cross the river to gain better intelligence, well, that is still fundamentally a defensive action, is it not?" It was a ludicrous, transparently false interpretation of the Supreme Commander's intent, and everyone in the room, Patton included, knew it. But it was, on the most slender of technicalities, defensible. And that was all the justification he needed. On the night of the 22nd of March, at 2200 hours, elements of Patton's 5th Infantry Division were quietly positioned near the small town of Oppenheim, some 35 kilometers south of Mainz. Here, the Rhine was a formidable 300 meters wide, a fast-flowing current of black water. The east bank was defended, but only lightly. The intelligence reports indicated the presence of the remnants of the German 7th Volksgrenadier Division, a unit that had been bled white in previous engagements and now numbered fewer than 1,200 exhausted men. The German High Command, like the Allied High Command, was fixated on the northern sector. They were bracing for Montgomery's sledgehammer blow at Wesel. No one, absolutely no one, anticipated that an American general would be mad enough to attempt a crossing at Oppenheim with a handful of stolen rubber boats and no preparatory fire. At precisely 2,230 hours, the first assault wave slipped into the water. It consisted of 12 boats, carrying 120 men from a company of the 11th Infantry Regiment. They moved in complete and utter silence. There was no deafening artillery barrage to announce their coming, no friendly aircraft overhead to provide cover, not even a searchlight to pierce the gloom. There was only the sound of 120 determined men, paddling their flimsy craft across the most important river in Germany under a sky devoid of stars. A young officer, Lieutenant Edward Graves, aged 24, was in the lead boat. He later recounted the intense, nerve-shattering stillness of the crossing. "We could hear the water slapping against the sides of the boat," he wrote, "and the soft dip of the paddles. We could make out the dark silhouettes of the trees on the far bank. But there were no shots, no flares, no shouting. It was eerie. The Germans simply didn't expect anyone to be foolish enough to try and cross without a full-scale preparation." The first boats scraped against the gravel of the eastern bank at 2,247 hours. There had not been a single shot fired. Not a single casualty. The German defenders had been caught completely, astonishingly, by surprise. By 23:30 hours, 2 full companies, 240 men, were securely on the east bank of the Rhine, fanning out and establishing a defensive perimeter. The silent ferrying operation continued throughout the night, a ghostly procession of men and equipment materializing on enemy soil. By 0100 hours on the morning of the 23rd of March, an entire battalion of 800 men had crossed. By 0600 hours, as the first grey light of dawn began to silhouette the landscape, 3 full battalions, some 2,400 American soldiers, controlled a secure bridgehead 3 kilometers wide on the German side of the river. And all this time, General Patton had maintained a strict and deliberate radio silence with SHAEF. Finally, at 0800 hours on the morning of the 23rd, with his bridgehead firm and his engineers already beginning work on a pontoon bridge, Patton decided it was time to inform his superiors. He placed a call to Eisenhower's headquarters in Reims. He did not, however, ask to speak to Eisenhower directly. He knew that would result in an immediate and explosive confrontation. Instead, he asked for Ike's chief of staff, the notoriously gruff General Walter Bedell Smith. "Good morning, Bedell," Patton began, his voice deceptively casual, as if he were calling to inquire about the weather. "Just calling to report that we've crossed the Rhine." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. One can imagine Smith, a man not easily flustered, processing the sheer effrontery of the statement. "What did you say?" he finally asked, his voice tight with disbelief. "The Third Army," Patton repeated, savoring the moment. "We crossed the Rhine last night at Oppenheim. We have 3 battalions on the east bank. 0 casualties. The Germans didn't even notice we were there until it was far too late." The line erupted. "George, for God's sake," Smith exploded, his voice crackling with fury. "You had explicit orders to maintain defensive positions. Ike is going to be absolutely furious." Patton's reply was a masterpiece of insolent calm. "Bedell, my orders were to maintain defensive positions west of the Rhine. I am now maintaining excellent defensive positions east of the Rhine. Technically, I'm still on the defensive." It was an absurd, infuriating, and utterly brilliant argument. Smith knew it, Patton knew it, and they both knew it worked for one simple reason: Patton had already done it. The bridgehead was established. The river was crossed. To reverse the action now would mean ordering an American army to retreat in the face of a broken enemy, a move that would be a military and political humiliation of the highest order. Smith took a deep, steadying breath. "Ike is going to kill you for this, George," he warned, his voice grim. "Well, let him come and find me on the other side of the Rhine," Patton retorted, and with a flourish of defiance, he hung up the telephone. Eisenhower's reaction was exactly as Patton had predicted: a quiet, contained, incandescent rage. As Supreme Commander, he could not publicly reprimand his most successful and aggressive field commander for achieving a spectacular victory. To do so would make it appear that he, Eisenhower, was somehow opposed to winning the war. It was politically untenable. But in private, Ike was livid. He was furious not just because Patton had disobeyed a direct order, but because the timing of the act had so completely and utterly upstaged Field Marshal Montgomery. The Britain's mammoth Operation Plunder, scheduled to be the glorious centerpiece of the Allied campaign, the event that would seize the headlines around the world, had now been relegated to a secondary role. It had been scooped by a man operating on stolen petrol and a shoestring budget. Patton knew this, of course, and he relished every moment of it. On the 24th of March, as Montgomery finally launched his massive, thunderous assault across the Rhine at Wesel, complete with its 4-day aerial bombardment and 2 airborne divisions, Patton already had 12,000 men and 50 tanks operating freely on the far side of the river at Oppenheim. The contrast was stark and, for Montgomery, deeply humiliating. To compound the insult, Patton placed a direct telephone call to the Field Marshal's headquarters that day. "Bernie," he began, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "Just calling to congratulate you on your crossing of the Rhine. I hear it was a most impressive affair." He paused for effect. "We just nipped across ourselves yesterday in some assault boats. No bombardment, no airborne divisions, 0 casualties. But I'm sure your operation was far more theatrical." Montgomery, a man not known for his sense of humor, especially when he was the butt of the joke, hung up without a word. The humiliation was absolute. But this rivalry, this deep-seated professional animosity between Patton and Montgomery, was more than just a clash of personalities. It was a fundamental clash of military doctrines. Montgomery embodied the British way of war, forged in the painful lessons of Dunkirk and the desert: meticulous planning, the amassing of overwhelming material superiority, and a cautious, methodical advance designed to minimize casualties at all costs. Patton, conversely, was the very personification of the emerging American doctrine: rapid mobility, lightning speed, calculated audacity, and the ruthless exploitation of enemy weaknesses before they had a chance to react. These two philosophies had been in conflict throughout the European campaign. In Normandy, Montgomery's methodical approach had seen him take weeks to capture the city of Caen, an objective that initial plans had allocated a mere 24 hours to secure. In the breakout across France, Patton's Third Army had liberated more territory in 3 weeks than Montgomery had in 3 months. In Belgium, it was Montgomery who had championed Operation Market Garden, the ambitious, massive airborne gamble that had ended in disaster and 17,000 Allied casualties. Patton had proposed an alternative, a powerful armored thrust that Eisenhower had rejected as being too risky. And now, at the Rhine, Patton had proven in the most dramatic fashion possible that speed and audacity could achieve what massive preparation could not: total surprise and a near-bloodless victory. The numbers, when laid side by side, tell the entire story. Montgomery's Operation Plunder involved 25 divisions, over 250,000 men, a 4-day preparatory bombardment, 3,500 artillery pieces, 1,200 tanks, and 2 airborne divisions. The cost, in the first 48 hours alone, was 3,968 Allied casualties. Patton's crossing at Oppenheim involved, initially, elements of 3 divisions, amounting to roughly 30,000 men. It had 0 preparatory bombardment and was conducted with stolen assault boats. The cost, in the first 48 hours, was a mere 34 casualties. Patton had crossed the most heavily defended river in Germany with less than 1/10 of Montgomery's resources and had suffered less than 1/100th of the casualties. And he had done it a day earlier. The crossing of the Rhine at Oppenheim was, therefore, far more than a simple tactical victory. It was a statement of intent, a validation of a philosophy. Patton had demonstrated that modern warfare was not won by obsessive preparation and logistical superiority alone, but by speed, daring, and the iron will to break the rules when those rules stood in the way of victory. Was his action legal? Technically, no. He had stolen petrol, disobeyed direct orders, and deliberately misled his superiors about his intentions. Did it work? Absolutely. The Third Army surged forward, advancing another 200 kilometers in the following 2 weeks, capturing over 80,000 German prisoners and shattering the last vestiges of organized resistance in southern Germany. By the 8th of May, VE Day, the Third Army had penetrated deeper into the Third Reich than any other Allied force. And it all began with an act of grand larceny and a general who simply refused to take no for an answer. General Hodges, the commander of the First Army, eventually confronted Patton about the missing 400,000 liters of petrol in April 1945. Patton, it is reported, looked at him with an expression of feigned innocence. "Courtney," he said, "if some of your petrol happened to end up in my tanks while they were crossing the Rhine, then I'd say your petrol helped to win the war. You should be proud. Hodges was not proud, but nor could he file a formal complaint without having to admit that his command had been negligent enough to lose a quantity of fuel sufficient to power an entire armored division. Patton was never officially sanctioned for the theft. In his post-war memoirs, Eisenhower offered a characteristically balanced and astute assessment of his most troublesome subordinate. George Patton, he wrote, was the most difficult commander under my command. He was also the most effective. His crossing of the Rhine at Oppenheim was strategically unnecessary, but tactically brilliant. It demonstrated that audacity, when executed with competence, can achieve impossible results with minimal resources. It was, perhaps, the coldest compliment in military history. Unnecessary, but brilliant. Patton would have considered it the highest praise. The rivalry between the two great Allied generals was never resolved. To his dying day, Montgomery would maintain that Patton was a reckless showman who risked his men's lives unnecessarily. Patton, for his part, would always regard Montgomery as a timid plodder who wasted precious time and opportunity with his excessive preparations. In a sense, they were both right. Montgomery's meticulousness saved lives, but it also squandered strategic chances. Patton's audacity won great victories, but his risks at times resulted in avoidable casualties. The war, in its complexity, required both types of commander. But only one of them crossed the Rhine with stolen boats, purloined petrol, and next to no casualties. And that commander made absolutely certain that